Welcome back to OpenLine. Our topic tonight certainly dense and not anything that any of us take any joy in talking about, but certainly important given the headlines that we've had in recent weeks and months talking about mass shootings and roles that firearms should play in society. And with us to navigate all of that is Dr. Laurie Woods from Vanderbilt University. Thank you again for being with us tonight. Want to get to the phone lines because we have a few people that have been waiting patiently. First, Wendell, go ahead with your question or comment. Thank you for calling into OpenLine.
All right, buddy. How y'all doing?
Doing well.
All right, great. Look, you know, the gun rights and everything, you can't really blame it on the guns itself. It's the crazy psycho people out there. And if they didn't have a gun, they might use a truck or something else. I mean, but back to the point that I want to say, or the comment I want to make. Somebody walks into a school like that and does something like they done, there should never be a court date. There should never be nothing like that. It should just be automatic death. I mean, their life should be took from them, period.
Wendell, we appreciate the call. Obviously, you know, if it was only so easy, I guess you could say, because obviously with a legal system, that's not quite how things work. But just wanted I'm curious to get your take on what Wendell had to say.
Well, on the one hand, I mean, I think we kind of feel that way, but on the other hand, it might be important to be able to capture someone alive to try to figure out what made them tick, find out who are they and why did they do it, and you know, what are the circumstances, and what are they angry about, what is their purpose, other than if there's any common denominator, common factor among mass shooters, it's probably that they want to be known. I want to be known, and that's the reason that I do it. I think it was Umpqua Community College in Oregon. There was a mass shooter there, like in 2015, and I remember he killed, I think, 8 or 9 people. And I remember it was either the sheriff or the police chief, whoever was the chief law enforcement officer, said, "You are never going to hear me say that person's name. I'll tell you the victim's name, but I will never say his name." And I thought, good. And for that reason, I don't really pay attention to who the shooters are. I don't care, but I don't want to know who they are.
And to that point, and I don't want to get too off the topic, but just so our viewers know, you know, I think a lot of people in journalism have rethought how we handle that as well. And a lot of newsrooms, ours included, will often have a policy of maybe you mention that name once right after it happens and then never again for that same reason. So that, you know, in hopes that immortality status isn't quite achieved. But there's something else that Wendell mentioned that I think could be a great moment to bring this in, is he talked about the mental health status.
Right.
These are psychos, to use Wendell's words, and I think for anybody that would do such an act, you can see how that qualification comes into play. But how does mental health and mental illness play into the conversation?
Well, first of all, when someone does something like that, we say they must be crazy to do that. You'd have to be crazy, or I think he said wacko, or you must be. But mental illness is everything from mild depression to paranoid schizophrenia. It is a long, long continuum. And do we say that, and there is no evidence, empirical evidence, that someone who has a mental health diagnosis is likely to commit a violent crime. There is just none. We can look back and say that someone, now we look at them and we see that maybe they had some mental health issues, but there is no way, certainly no way to predict. I asked my students this morning about, like, in Minority Report, and they looked at me like I was nuts. They'd never heard of the movie because it was too long ago for them. But, you know, we can't predict crime. All we can say is that this person had these characteristics. But we can't say that mental illness is likely to result in crime, because those who are mentally ill, even diagnosed mentally ill, are no more likely to commit a crime than anybody else. And maybe against themselves, but not more likely to commit a violent crime. And so it's really unfair to jump to that immediately and say, well, it's mental illness, let's ban the mentally ill. What does that mean? You're going to ban the person who is bipolar and is regulated by medication? And which doctors are you going to require to make that diagnosis? It's too easy to say we're just going to put that Band-Aid on it, because that's not going to work. One of the things with the Las Vegas shooter who shot into the country music festival, they can never find out anything about him except that he had a bunch of guns and a bump stock and he shot a bunch of people. They could not find any particular reason. He had no mental illness. He had nothing that they could pin it on. No box they could put him in.
And when you're talking about diagnoses, you can't help but think, especially on the more extreme sides of when you're talking about judges and also obviously physicians, that it would have to make a institutionalizing decision, taking away someone's personal freedoms. They have to have a lot of evidence of that as well before they could take a step like that.
Oh, absolutely. Now, it's true, there's some, you can't carry a gun, you can't buy a gun if you have been adjudicated as mentally ill. But like in the case of the Virginia Tech shooter, he had gone to court and voluntarily agreed to go to outpatient counseling and was able to buy a gun. I think his mother might have given it. He had a gun and shot and killed a number of students. So it's too complicated, it's too tricky, and it would be too easy to think it's a fix when it's not.
Absolutely. Lee has been waiting patiently to chime in. Lee, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to make a point about people who think that AR-15s is a necessary weapon to defend your house. It's absolutely stupid. The maximum range of an AR-15 with a 223 round is over 3,500 yards. And you are responsible for where that bullet goes and who it kills. If it kills your neighbor, you're responsible for that. It kills your neighbor. If it kills somebody driving down the road 5 blocks over, you're responsible for that. A 308 is even worse. The maximum range of a 308 is over 5,000 yards. The best weapon to defend your house is probably a shotgun, a 12-gauge or 20-gauge shotgun, but bird shots will dissuade anybody from coming in your front door. And it's not going to kill somebody across the street.
Right.
Dissuade. I love the use of dissuade.
Like
Lee, thank you for the call and excellent point. And I think that goes back to, harkens back to some of our conversation earlier, where you hear even law enforcement sources saying, AR-15 is not, your self-defense weapon of choice by any means. Right. So just to continue on the mental health conversation that we were having before, when you hear lawmakers call for more resources for that, is there any part of that conversation that could be helpful when we're talking about these mass casualty events?
Oh, sure. I mean, if they would put money into, for instance, the mental health response to, rather than sending the police, and there's lots of different, it's called STAR, and there's one in Nashville that the Behavioral Health Foundation has proposed called HEALS, and, to send professionals out to deal with with people who are having mental health crisis as opposed to police. Sure, more money would certainly help. That would be excellent. But the fear is that if you paint people with mental health issues, and I don't even call it mental illness because it's mental health issues, you paint everybody with the same brush. People are already fighting that stigma, and it's really unfair.
Absolutely. I think you have an interesting perspective. If you're just joining us, Dr. Woods, in addition to being in the world of academia now, you have an extensive background in law enforcement. As you're talking about, having mental health professionals that can respond to some of situations as opposed to police, I'm curious your insight as a law enforcement official. Would that have been helpful when you were serving in law enforcement?
Oh, absolutely. We didn't, we just get them in the police car any way you can and get them to whatever medical center. We didn't really, it was a long time ago, I'm not very young, but we had minimal training, and it would have been wonderful to have somebody come out and know how to handle things. We just knew, what police officers are trained to do is take care of the situation, because you got to move on to the next thing. So to have, and it's always about time, right? There isn't a lot of time to do things. So if you had somebody who could go out and talk to the people who are having a crisis, avoid the police, because the police presence right there is, can make people more agitated. So somebody who's willing to take the time, and the gentleman who came and talked to one of my classes, his name was Elliot Pinsley, he said, the best weapon you have is a cigarette. You give someone with a mental health crisis a cigarette and talk to them. Yeah, would have been wonderful to have somebody other than us trying to do it, because all we did was handcuff him, put him in the police car, and take him to the medical center.
Just this week, another kind of topic that often sometimes comes up when we're talking about mental health, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee signed an executive order encouraging schools to look into ways of making them to be, in a law enforcement term, a harder target, hardening of school security. Is there a role that conversation should play in the aftermath of a tragedy like this in Uvalde?
Well, sure, absolutely. I mean, schools have to leave the doors locked. They have to, but as I said, with the cycle of things, people start locking their doors and then they get a little bit lax because time has passed. So they have to be pretty strict measures. And, I believe he called for more school resource officers, and, school resource officers were actually initially used in some places as just to be a resource for students. And then they sort of got dragged into that, be doing enforcement on campus, which made for difficult relationships with students. And so some places took school resource officers out of schools, and then some other places, after Columbine High School, they called for them to be in schools everywhere. But sure, if there's money in that to keep more doors locked, to keep better security at schools, of course, that's great.
Sure, absolutely. I want to circle back to, and it sounds like this is really kind of within your sphere of expertise when it comes to gun culture. And, obviously for many people, and especially in our area, they can be deeply ingrained with being outdoorsmen and, hunting and that kind of thing. But do you see a difference between that and then, the culture that may be more attracted to a high-powered AR-15 style rifle or something like that is often used in these type of incidents?
Actually, I'm not sure what your question is.
Sure. No, I guess I'm saying, like, when you're talking about the overall gun culture, where does people that have a really high interest in some of these really high-powered rifles fit into the conversation? Maybe that's a better way to ask it.
I mean, that's sort of a niche of people. There aren't that many people who want to have AR-15 rifles or assault type rifles. If you have an assault type rifle, you typically would be a collector, somebody who has a lot of guns. So that's like a different kind of person. Most people have, in the research that, for instance, Pew Research does, most people say the number one reason they have guns is for protection, and that's overwhelmingly the reason for women. And then the second for men is hunting. But more and more, we're getting people who, and of course the gun sales went up during COVID, and gun sales typically will go up after a mass shooting for two reasons. One is people become afraid, and the second is they're afraid the government's going to come in and take their guns away, so they buy more guns. But so we just keep putting more and more guns into the system, and then people leave them in their cars and they get stolen, and they're, back out there.
You've mentioned tonight in our broadcast a couple times of how you talk to your students about this, obviously, because you teach about these topics. Did you have a class actually when Uvalde happened, and how did you guys kind of talk about that in class?
Actually, no, because we just started class this week, and what we talked about, though, was the whole mental illness aspect. And I asked them, do you think this is a case of mental illness? And they all said, no, it's not, because mental health is the same as physical health. It's just different. It's just for your heart and your brain. It's not your body, but it's your mind, and of course it's your heart as well. But it's just another aspect. It's not a separate thing. It's not people with mental health issues are bad people. They're just people dealing with the same kinds of things that people with physical health issues are dealing with. And so, they were surprised to think that it would be mental health that's the issue.
Absolutely. We need to fit in another break right here, but we only have one more segment left with Dr. Woods. If you have a question or comment for her, make sure you call it in the next couple minutes. We'll be right back.